In the heart of a small town, where dusty roads wound between cozy homes, the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and music. This close-knit community had a charm all its own. Everyone knew each other, from the eldest grandparent to the youngest child. Neighbors waved hello as they passed by, sharing stories and news over fences and porches. Music was the lifeblood of this town. It echoed through the streets during festivals and gatherings. The fiddler, an elderly man with nimble fingers and a twinkle in his eye, was a beloved figure. His tunes could make people dance, laugh, or even cry. Every Saturday night, townsfolk gathered in the old barn for square dances and celebrations, with the fiddler leading them into joyful melodies that seemed to weave together their lives. Traditions were strong here. Families came together for community picnics in the summer and cozy bonfires in the fall, where tales of old were shared alongside roasted marshmallows. The town prided itself on being supportive, helping one another through both happy times and sorrowful moments. But beneath this charming exterior lay tensions that could erupt when least expected. The recent trial had left its mark on everyone, making even the most cheerful faces turn somber. Although they shared common joys, the events that unfolded would soon test the bonds that held this community together, revealing just how fragile their unity could be when faced with anger and blame. On the fateful night of the gathering, the barn glowed warmly under a canopy of twinkling lights. The townsfolk buzzed with excitement, their laughter mingling with the sweet scent of homemade pies and freshly baked bread. The fiddler arrived with his cherished instrument slung over his shoulder, ready to weave magic through his music. As he settled into his favorite spot on the wooden stage, a hush fell over the crowd, eager for the evening's festivities to begin. With the first stroke of his bow against the strings, the air transformed. The enchanting tunes danced like fireflies in the night, drawing everyone closer. Couples twirled in time to the lively rhythms, while children clapped and giggled in delight. Each note seemed to echo the heartbeats of those present, reminding them of their shared joy. As the night progressed, the fiddler played a mix of fast jigs and slow waltzes, captivating even the most reserved townspeople. What they didn't know was that beneath this joyous facade lay simmering tensions from the recent trial, a trial that had left many hearts heavy. The atmosphere swirled with excitement but also unease, as murmurs about the judge's verdict lingered in hushed tones. Some smiled through their worries while others stared into their cups, reflecting on what this night truly meant for their town. Little did they realize that this beautiful evening would soon be clouded by anger and blame, forever changing their community's story. In the midst of the festivities, there was another figure in town whose presence loomed larger than most, the judge. Known for his fairness and seasoned wisdom, he had always been a respected leader in the community. His decisions were often seen as final, and townsfolk trusted him to uphold justice. However, recent weeks had found him in a troubling state. The pressures of the trial, combined with his fondness for drink, led him to indulge more than usual. On that fateful night, the judge sat at the edge of the barn, nursing a glass while listening to the lively music. His usually sharp mind was clouded by alcohol, blurring his judgment and ability to grasp the weight of the issues before him. He laughed along with others but felt a growing unease within himself. Whispers about his verdict swirled through his thoughts like a storm. Despite his unsteady state, he attempted to appear composed as he engaged in small talk with neighbors. Yet inside, he grappled with doubts about the recent ruling that had left many unhappy. The joyous tunes of the fiddler contrasted sharply with his internal conflict, hinting at how one moment of weakness could ripple through this tightly woven community. As night deepened, tensions simmered not only among the townsfolk but also within the judge himself. Little did he know that his actions would soon lead to consequences far beyond what anyone could foresee, marking this evening as a turning point in their lives. The night of the verdict arrived, casting a shadow over the community that had once felt so joyful. As the judge prepared to announce his decision, the air thickened with tension. Many townspeople gathered in the courtroom, hoping for a fair outcome that would bring closure to the recent tragedy. However, as the judge took a deep breath and spoke, gasps filled the room. His ruling was startling: the accused would walk free due to lack of evidence. The judge's words, clouded by his earlier indulgence, echoed harshly in the silence that followed. Disbelief rippled through the crowd as whispers turned into heated discussions. How could he let a guilty person slip away? It felt like a betrayal to many who had trusted his judgment for so long. The victims' sons were visibly shaken, their faces contorted with rage and grief. They stood at the front of the courtroom, fists clenched, struggling to contain their anguish. Unable to believe what they had just heard, they stormed out, their voices rising in anguished cries as they proclaimed injustice. The news of the verdict spread quickly, igniting flames of anger throughout the town. That evening, conversations shifted from the merry tunes of the fiddler to accusatory debates over drinks and dinner tables. Friends turned against each other as alliances formed based on opinions about the judge's controversial decision. Little did they know that this moment would not only test their relationships but also set into motion events that would change their lives irrevocably. In the wake of the judge's shocking verdict, the victims' sons found it difficult to contain their fury. They believed that the enchanting tunes of the fiddler had somehow influenced the judge's judgment, weaving a connection between their father's fate and the music that had once brought happiness to their lives. As they vented their frustrations to friends, they painted a vivid picture. The fiddler's joyful melodies had lulled the judge into a haze, obscuring his sense of justice. How could he make such a decision after listening to that music? One son shouted, his voice thick with anger. It was as if the fiddler tune enchanted him, making him forget what really mattered. The idea quickly spread among their peers, morphing into an accusation that seemed plausible to many in their state of grief and confusion. At local gatherings and around dinner tables, conversations shifted toward blaming the fiddler for the outcome. They argued that his lively music had created an illusion of joy that distracted the judge from the gravity of the trial. The sons felt justified in their belief, convinced that if it weren't for the fiddler performance on that fateful night, their father might have received the justice he deserved. This blame game intensified divisions within the community. Friends who had once enjoyed music together now eyed each other warily. The fiddler, who had always been a source of joy, suddenly became a target of resentment. Little did they know that this misplaced blame would deepen wounds and alter relationships in ways they couldn't yet foresee. Amid the flickering lights and fading music of the barn, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The victims' sons, fueled by grief and anger, marched through the crowd with a fierce determination. Their faces were etched with pain as they spotted the fiddler in a corner, still reveling in the last notes of his performance. To them, he was no longer a beloved figure, he was an architect of their father's fate. With a sudden burst of rage, they approached him, their voices rising over the dwindling laughter. "You! It's your fault," one son shouted, grabbing the fiddler's arm and pulling him away from the revelry. The fiddler looked startled, his eyes wide with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I'm just a musician," he stammered, desperately trying to defend himself. But their grief overshadowed any reason. They dragged him toward the exit, their shouts echoing in the barn. "Your music enchanted the judge. You made him forget justice." Another son added, his voice shaking with emotion. The crowd fell silent, shocked by this unexpected confrontation. Some stared in disbelief while others whispered among themselves, uncertain how to react. The fiddler struggled against their grip but felt powerless against their fury. "Please, it's just music," he pleaded, but his words fell on deaf ears. As they pulled him into the night air, it became clear that this confrontation was not just about blame, it symbolized the fracture of a community once united by joy now torn apart by sorrow and resentment. The cool night wind carried their anger away as they stepped into darkness, leaving behind echoes of what once was. As the sons dragged the fiddler away from the barn, confusion spread across his face like a shadow. "Wait! You don't understand," he exclaimed, his voice trembling as he struggled to keep pace with their furious grip. The joy he once brought to the community now felt distant as he faced their despair head-on. "I'm just a musician. My music is meant to bring happiness, not to cast blame," he pleaded, desperation creeping into his tone. Music can lift spirits and soothe hearts, it does not dictate actions or beliefs. But the more he tried to explain, the less they listened. Their grief had turned into a storm of rage, drowning out his words. One son turned sharply, eyes blazing with anger. Your music lulled him into a false sense of security. You have no idea how your foolish tunes affect people. His accusation hung thick in the air, leaving the fiddler even more bewildered. He wanted to shout that music couldn't be held responsible for the choices others made, especially the judge's questionable verdict, but his voice faltered. The fiddler could see the pain etched in their faces, and it pained him deeply to witness their suffering. I never meant for it to be this way, he cried out, trying to reach them through their anger. Yet his pleas fell on deaf ears as they continued to pull him into the night. It became painfully clear that no explanation would suffice, their minds were made up, and in their grief, they could only see him as the enemy. The fiddler silently mourned not only for their lost joy but also for the chasm that had formed between them all. The confrontation outside the barn quickly drew the attention of other townspeople, who had been enjoying the festivities just moments before. Shocked gasps filled the air as they witnessed the victim's sons dragging the fiddler toward the shadows. Some watched in silence, unsure of how to respond, while others instinctively rushed to intervene. A group of friends, loyal to the victim's family, rallied behind the sons. He deserves this, one shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Can't you see? His music led to our father's suffering. Their anger resonated with a few bystanders who nodded in agreement, swept up in the fervor of their shared grief. The idea that the fiddler had played a role in the judge's verdict spread like wildfire among them, painting him as a villain in a tale of tragedy. However, not everyone was convinced. A handful of townsfolk stepped forward to defend the fiddler, recalling all the joy he had brought to their community. This isn't right, one woman exclaimed, her voice strong and firm. The fiddler only played his heart out, music can't be blamed for a decision made by a man. Others murmured in agreement, echoing her sentiments. As arguments erupted among the crowd, divisions deepened within the town. Friends became foes, and long-standing relationships began to fray as opinions clashed. This once unified community now stood at a crossroads, grappling with grief and anger that threatened to tear them apart. Little did they know that this confrontation would linger far beyond that night, changing their lives forever. Later that evening, as the ruckus outside the barn subsided, the judge found himself alone in a dimly lit corner, his heart heavy with regret. He leaned against the rough wooden wall, the sounds of anger and blame still echoing in his mind. The joyous laughter that had filled the barn earlier felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the chaos that had erupted. In this quiet moment, clarity began to seep through the fog of alcohol that had clouded his judgment. He reflected on the verdict he had delivered earlier and how his state had led him to overlook the essence of justice. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, grappling with the realization that he had allowed his personal struggles to influence a critical decision. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him as he thought about how many lives were affected by his actions. The judge remembered the victim's sons, their grief transformed into rage, and felt a pang of sorrow for their pain. Justice should have been served, he thought, understanding now that true justice required more than just following the law, it demanded empathy and discernment. As he closed his eyes, he envisioned a community where music brought people together, not divided them. It was clear to him now that he must seek redemption, not only for himself but for the town he had unwittingly torn apart. The road ahead seemed daunting, but he understood that acknowledging his failings was the first step toward mending what had been broken. As the dust began to settle in the wake of the turbulent events, the community found itself at a crossroads, faced with the lessons learned from the recent turmoil. The judge, now committed to seeking redemption, understood that personal responsibility was paramount. It was not just his actions but also the ripple effects they had on others that must be addressed. He recognized that true justice requires empathy, a deep understanding of the lives entangled in every decision made. Meanwhile, the fiddler, once vilified, became a beacon of hope as he resumed playing in public spaces. His music slowly transformed from a source of blame into a healing balm for the community's wounds. Families began to gather again around his melodies, allowing his tunes to mend hearts and bridge divides. The townspeople realized that music could unite them if they chose to listen with open hearts rather than judgmental ears. As conversations shifted from anger to understanding, relationships were cautiously reformed. The victims' sons grew to see how their grief had blinded them and allowed resentment to cloud their judgment. They approached the fiddler with apologies and open minds, learning that forgiveness could pave the way for healing. In this way, the community emerged stronger, having grasped the vital importance of understanding and communication amid sorrow. Through the lens of their shared experience, they discovered that joy can resurrect even in dark times and that compassion is essential in finding true justice and unity. Together, they vowed to create a town where music would always resonate as a reminder of their journey toward healing and acceptance.